Good morning, Elizabeth, and thank you so much for joining us here in New Zealand and sharing your experiences. A few questions. So if we start by looking in the New Zealand context, to some extent we talk all the time about not achieving our diversity targets. However, when you look at New Zealand, Auckland in particular, one of the most diverse cities in the world, we have some of the most amazing role models when you look at our Prime Minister, our Governor-General and our Chief Justice. Phenomenal women leading small and medium businesses in New Zealand, but the numbers aren't showing. We're not getting the cut through in our larger businesses. Public sector getting there, but not in the private sector. I wonder if you can share your thoughts on that and where we might look to try and move the dial faster.
Yeah, and it's wonderful to be here, Vanessa. Thank you very much for inviting me to your event today. Australia, we look over at New Zealand and we see so many talented, powerful women in high-profile positions, and we're quite envious of that. But I think your success there is actually has another side to it as well, and it may be in that there are, and I'd say quite a large number of people in New Zealand who think that gender equality is finished business. The fact is you've had a number of prime ministers, not just one like Australia, but a number. You've had heads of states, you've had many ministers. You're doing well, particularly in political empowerment. But actually the area that still needs significant work is, as you say, the private sector. And I think to help people understand it's not just enough to give them the data. So the fact that there's not very many CEOs of large organisations, that there's only 19% of women on boards, that's helpful, but by itself it's not enough. You need to start engaging, I think, with leaders, not just their heads, but also their minds. Not just their minds, but also their hearts. That's what's important about taking people from being, reasonably complacent to strong action. And that's one of the areas where we've had quite a deal of success in Australia.
And can you think of some examples of?
Yeah, so what I've found, and even if I can just talk about our Male Champions of Change strategy for a minute. So we started small. We had a group of men, 6 men. We decided to make it male only because there is no other place where men are accountable for change equally with women. So we started with 6 men. When I went to those men, yes, I put the data before them, but I actually helped them see, and I still remember the first man I spoke to. He was the CEO of IBM across Australia and New Zealand. He had twins, a son and a daughter. And I helped him understand that without intervention by a powerful man like him, his daughter would never have the same opportunities as her twin brother, all because she was a girl. And what father wants their daughter to be impeded or limited because of man-made barriers, essentially? And that was really about engaging him. So I think trying to help leaders find that personal commitment, whether it's in their family or indeed whether it's about their business, because what we know unequivocally is those businesses which have greater levels of diversity, starting with gender first, they perform better. That's a fact. So if you care about your business, you need to care about this strategy.
And so let's just pick up on the Male Champions of Change. So started with 6. Where's it got to today, and what's the learnings that we could reflect on?
So where we are today, we have now 160 of the most influential and powerful men in Australia as Male Champions of Change. It started as quite a controversial strategy. Was this just about men reinforcing the patriarchy? Was it about a further exclusion of women? But I think many now have started to see, no, this is a strategy about power, and gender equality is about sharing power. So we identified in Australia that our national institutions, our major organisations, that the power in those organisations largely sat in the hands of men. Men held the levers of power. So if we want change, we need powerful, influential men taking the message to other men. The fact is, up until probably the last 10 years, we've made progress because of a collective activism of women, and I'd suggest that's the same here in New Zealand, which is terrific, and we need to honour that and recognise that. Collective activism of women will still be important into the future, but by itself it won't be enough. We need the collective action of men, and that's really the Male Champions of Change. So where we are now, we're with 160 influential leaders. They're vice-chancellors of universities, they're heads of our Treasury, Prime Minister and Cabinet, Attorney Generals. They're the heads of our military, the heads of most of our large private sector organisations, all our banks, Telstra, our communications. So they're a great diversity of men. And what we've found is when we put the chief of army beside the head of IBM, you get a really interesting conversation, not just conversation, but a breakthrough strategy on flexibility.
Right.
And what is happening now is every one of our 10 groups are trialling breakthrough strategies that are developed in that group. So the members of a group will trial that strategy in their organisation. They will learn from that, and they'll offer up the strategy and the learning to everyone else in the community of practice, so our whole 160. And so what we're seeing is that the whole group lifts, the whole 160, and their organisations, which represent a significant proportion of our Australian workforce.
And the role of women
Yeah.
in those groups.
Yeah.
So it is a male champions have changed, but how can
Yeah.
the woman feed in to assist?
You're
the
absolutely
process?
right. Women are a really important part of a strategy as well. What happens is women make up some of the groups. They come in as a special advisor. That is, that the accountability and responsibility for change still stays with the men. It doesn't shift to the women in the group. The women are there to give their advice, their experience to the men about what actions they believe should be taken and to really inform the discussion. And in some of our groups, because one of the markers of success is as a male CEO, your successor is a female CEO, someone
Right.
you've sponsored and groomed. In some of our groups, we're getting almost to a point of gender balance
Right.
in the group, because those male CEOs have had women succeed them. Then that woman comes in as a special advisor. But I think what's really critical is that this issue needs to be positioned not as a women's issue. This is a key economic and social issue for our nation, and therefore it is not an issue that sits on the shoulders of women to solve. It's everyone's business, essentially. Right. And that's why the strategy is quite disruptive. It's got a hard edge, yep. It's controversial, and that's what I think has allowed it to have strong momentum, because right. You're as likely to hear men speak about gender equality issues as women in Australia today.
Yeah.
And that's a real shift in our discourse.
Huge shift. So can I pick up on another dimension of the woman participating in those groups though, and that's, if I think of our global women members, the role of women as role models. And often today we'll hear our younger women say, I don't aspire to be like that.
Yeah.
And I think what they are referring to is they want to be successful as a woman. So what would your advice be to influential women and how best they can role model and nurture the future generation of women leaders?
Because you're so right on that. You know, it's sad, but the reality is that for some women who are at the top of organisations now, they had to make a choice between having a career or having a family. And I think no woman wants to have to be put in that place. Indeed, no man. Work and family should not be at opposite ends of one hard choice. So what we need is women who are bringing all the skills that they have, their skills as a mother, their deep femininity and feminine energy. That's the whole argument for diversity. Because when you review all the information about why diverse organisations do better, and if I look at gender diversity, the fact is if you bring women into a male-dominated organisation, or indeed men into a female-dominated organisation, the group dynamics change and everyone lifts. So the idea that women can't be truly women and authentic in the work environment, it negates everything that's beneficial about diversity. So I think both women and men can be really strong role models for young women coming through. I think, I always believe human rights starts at home. We need to be the change that we want to see. So I just know in my role, and just to give you an example, as Sex Discrimination Commissioner, so it was a very busy full-time role, travelling all around Australia, internationally to the UN, NATO, World Bank, many places. And I found after the first 6 months that I really was travelling way too much. And, I had young kids at that time. And I remember having a conversation with my daughter where she said, "Mum, you know, you talk about work and family, but where are you? I don't see you." And I just thought it was a really one of those moments of truth. And I thought, I'm out there espousing it, but I'm not living it. So how credible am I? And indeed, you know, there would be a million arguments where I could argue, well, you know, the role's so important or this or that. No, what in the end I decided to do was, she was in the early years at school, so but particularly during the school holidays, I'd try and schedule some of my travel there, and Lucy would come with me. So I remember I'd go to the Federal Parliament and I'd have a meeting with the Attorney General, and I'd say to him, look, I hope you don't mind, but my 6-year-old will be taking our notes. I mean, what's he going to say? He'll see the other Sex Discrimination Commissioner. There is none. So people were used to it. And, you know, I would turn up. And that's who I was. And I was someone with caring responsibilities. I made them visible. Not only that, it was such a strong part of who I am. And I have to say, in the work I did in Aboriginal communities, so travelling to a lot of remote Aboriginal communities and in regional Australia, the fact that I was a mother, that's what mattered. I didn't care whether I was a commissioner or a minister or this or that. That really wasn't that relevant. But I had a place in a family. I had caring responsibility. So it actually gave me a level of engagement that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
I'm sitting here reflecting. I've got a board meeting in the school holidays coming up. I can see my young son and daughter coming along to take the minutes.
Oh, I think it would be fantastic, absolutely. I remember in that situation though, my daughter, she said, Mum, I need to go to the toilet. I'm going, yes, this is a very important meeting with the Attorney General. No, Mum, I need to go to the toilet now. Okay, sorry, stop the meeting. My daughter needs to go to the toilet. But, you know, that's life. Life sometimes is messier and whatever, and that's what's real. Fantastic. It's real. And not only that, I think in those moments where we reveal exactly who we are, that moment of vulnerability and sharing, that's what brings together high-performing teams. Yeah. So it's so important.
Great. So can I just, thinking about the role of woman, so we've traversed the journey of the basis for the male champions for change and then needing to lead the change because of their positions of power. But I want to just have the conversation with you about backlash.
Yeah.
Whether for males or females, that when you take on this cause, and it is something that's not unique to our countries, it is a global issue.
Yeah.
You know, it is challenging. Because there is backlash, and only as recent as yesterday in New Zealand with one of our MPs making a statement that creates real tension. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you're seeing here in New Zealand is a global picture. Because of my global role, I see how women's human rights defenders, they might be women, but they might be men, but they're out there advocating for women's rights, gender equality. We're seeing an increasing number of reprisals against those women. I mean, in many nations, if I speak out strongly about women's rights, I risk incarceration. I risk being disappeared or death in some nations. I mean, I'm thinking of the women who are removing their hijabs in Iran. I'm thinking of the women in El Salvador who are being incarcerated for miscarrying their own baby, having been seen to be killing their own baby. You know, I could give you many, many examples. And even in Australia, I think, and I feel personally, you know, just in the advocacy work I do, I feel more at risk now, reputationally, than I ever have in my working life. And I think what we're seeing globally is really a rollback. It's coming about from a number of global forces. One is the increasing authoritarian regimes in different nations. It's the rise of extremist ideologies, particularly fundamentalist religion and fundamentalist ideologies. It's about the populist voice coming through, and we see some of, you know, the other democracies, the US and others, where there's kind of license given to really anti-women, anti-gender equality views. So those people are speaking out more lightly, and even I'm seeing social norms in nations shift. I'm seeing the rollback of legislation, particularly relating to women's reproductive rights and termination. I'm seeing that across Europe. So that's the era that we're living in, and I just think one thing about backlash, usually if you're seeing it in an organisation, it means that you're above the target in a sense, because if you're not seeing any pushback on what's a fundamental shift in an organisation, you're really wondering whether anyone cares. And in a change agenda, particularly cultural change, actually people need to care. Whether they care violently, negatively or positively, in a sense, doesn't really matter, but the worst thing for a change agenda is not to get engagement. So backlash is not necessarily a bad thing in those environments, but it will present either as passive resistance, active hostility, or indeed people just not being prepared to go on that journey. And depending on where they sit, so ordinarily in the work that I do in organisations, I'll see a group of progressives who really understand why the business needs to shift, that the demographic of a talent pool's shifting, that they need to be representative of the nation they're serving, the community they're serving, so they'll get it. You've got by far the bulk of people who sit in the middle who are a bit wavering. Let's see what the boss says, what will my boss think of it, I'll go whichever way. And then you've got some which are deeply hostile. And I see that sometimes in military environments where they just believe that women have no place. Right. So I think the strategies that I know make a difference is firstly creating space for all the views to be held, to be aired, even this one about women have no place. Because, you know, to understand what are the influences and experiences that have shaped that individual to hold that view, I think can be very instructive. Yeah. And indeed, if you just demolish that view, you're not just demolishing the view, you're demolishing everything about the influences that created that individual. Mm-hmm. So it's how do you hold all those differing views and then helps people see that while history has probably been kind to them in the past, that the future will be quite different. They have the opportunity to come on board because that's what the business needs, but also if they choose not to, then that's okay as well, but they need to choose a different career to the one they have in this organisation. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, we do need to move people on. You know, everyone will fit in somewhere, but in an organisation going through significant cultural change, not everyone will fit. And it's how do you do that? The other strategy I know that is quite transformative in this area is what I call purposeful storytelling. So for this bulk of people in the middle, they'll say, well, actually, what's wrong with where we're at today? You know, we've got enough women and, you know, we're not disrespectful and whatever. What we need in that to get these people to move on is actually for them to see the adverse consequences of the current culture. Now, the only way you can do that is to get people to tell their stories. And I've just seen it have transformative impact in so many organisations. When I get up and say, in a safe environment, and I share about the fact that I've been sexually harassed, the fact that, you know, that because of the requirements of a job, I've missed out on the key moments in my children's life. The fact that I've never been able to live the life and the expectations that I had for my life because of the way the culture's currently operating. They're the moments of truth when even the most ardent and hostile people often will have a shift. It's just that they've never seen that before.
Elizabeth, I'd just like to pick up on that culture point because I think some of our real champions in organisations have been doing a huge amount and got our numbers up in our senior executive ranks only to find they weren't sustainable. And as they dig underneath that, they find that the issue's cultural and that the numbers were one thing, but they hadn't really created an inclusive culture that was welcoming and embracing of that diversity. And I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that, reflections. I hear you when you talk about sharing stories can assist, but any other thoughts?
Yeah, it's what you say is so true. I mean, in fact, the research seems to suggest that if you have the diversity without the inclusion, you won't get any of the capability benefits and the performance benefits that the diversity dividend ordinarily delivers. And what we know is an inclusive culture is a magnet for diverse talent. But the question is, how do you build inclusion in the culture? And really the two elements that from the work that I've done, but also from some of the research, I don't know if you've heard of Project Aristotle. So it was Google's quest to find out what creates the high-performing teams. And, you know, Google put together every combination of teams, you know, the Nobel Prize winners, the not so bright ones, the respectful ones, the disrespectful ones, every combination. And when they mined the data and a lot of the research, yes, diversity was important, but what was even more important were the two elements that are defining, and they put those down to shared vulnerability. So a team where everyone could be authentic, could talk about what was messy and sad, where people knew where that individual was at in their life circumstance, where they were able to bring their whole self to work. That was the first thing. And the second was psychological safety. So the ability for me to talk about things that are not ordinarily talked about in the workplace. Human things, our shared humanity, that's what really brought teams together. So it didn't matter whether you had the smart ones or the not so smart ones or this or that. If you had shared vulnerability and psychological safety, you were that was what was leading to high performance. And I think it's so interesting when you think about it, it's right. It's when we connect deeply as humans that we can withstand all the ups and downs of business day and whatever, and that we continue to press forward together despite obstacles that'll be jumping up on the along the way. Because when we can bring our whole selves to work and we won't be judged for who we are, which is the psychological safety part of it, that's when all the discretionary energy and intellect that I have will be put into the team and shared around. So, and just to give you an example of that, I was lucky enough to work with Australia's military for many years. I travelled all around the world. I was in Afghanistan beyond the wire in Oregon province. I was in other deployed bases, from submarines to frigates to Black Hawks and C-130s. But when I came onto a base or into a military installation, people found out I was on the base and they'd want to come and tell me their stories. And I heard incredible stories, but many were ones that had never been told before because it just wasn't safe to speak. And just listening to these stories, I thought it's one thing for me to hear the stories because I was actually reviewing the military, the treatment of women. I had to table reports in the Parliament, so that was important. I heard the stories. But what was more important was that those who had the power to create change in the military heard those stories. So we flew in women from all over Australia. I asked them to bring a support person, and most of them brought their beautiful mothers so that they could sit down one-on-one with the most senior leaders to hear what it's like to be sexually assaulted by your instructor, the very person you go to for advice, what it's like to have your career trashed because you made a formal complaint, what it was like to be excluded, so to go on exercise for months on end and no one spoke to you. These were women who loved the military as much as the male leaders, but their service had come at an unacceptable personal cost. I still remember one beautiful woman. She looked into the eyes of a chief and she said, "Look, I gave you the person I love most in the world, and this is how you've treated her." So that was a moment of shared vulnerability. Those men, the military men, they came with no military garb. They came as one human being to listen deeply to another. And, it takes courage to do that, particularly when you don't know what you're going to hear. And I think it was those moments of shared vulnerability that actually have had a really long-lasting impact on Australia's military. They've now had over 800 of those conversations across their leadership level and whatever. And so you've got a group of change agents who understand the case for change, not just with their heads, but also with their hearts. And that's what we need to do in organisations.
Yeah, hugely powerful.
Yeah.
And I think that technique is something we can take into our businesses. You talk about psychological vulnerability. There is one aspect, particularly relevant to New Zealand, may also be in Australia, that I think is new to us when we think about it in the context of diversity and inclusion, and that's domestic violence and the relevance of that to the conversation around diversity and inclusion. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, domestic violence. So it's happening in New Zealand. I know there's a report every 5 minutes of domestic violence. It's equally happening in Australia. So it's a scourge on both our nations. And my quest when I set up a Male Champions of Change, it was about addressing the underrepresentation of women at leadership level. But as we went on, we started to understand that domestic violence was a reason that women weren't in public life as much. And also for those that were, trying to hold down a job while living in a violent relationship was just almost impossible. So I thought about how I would take this issue to the men, because often it's seen, oh no, that's a private issue between him and her over there. And I wanted the men to see that what affects employees affects employers. It's actually an employer's issue as well. So coming back to that shared vulnerability point, I brought in 2 survivors of domestic violence. One was Rosie Batty, who you may know about here, but a beautiful woman who'd been in paid work, had a violent relationship, and indeed her husband actually beat her son to death with a cricket bat at cricket practice. I mean, indescribable. It was a pivotal point in our nation. It was the day the nation woke up about domestic violence, and Rosie has been such a strong advocate. So I brought her in, together with another woman, Christy McKellar, to sit down with the male champions of change for several hours and just tell the stories of what it was like to hold down a job when, you know, just basic things. So your husband didn't like the fact that you were taller than him when you put your work shoes on. So Christy's husband would saw the heels off her work shoes. He'd leave the baby unattended. He'd ring up and abuse her down the phone at work. And she talks about the time that one day he did that. He used to ring an abuser, and a woman who was sitting nearby said, "Gee, we shouldn't have to take calls from customers like that." Christy said, "No, that was no customer. That was my husband." And indeed, that woman didn't know what to do, and many of us wouldn't. She just kept on writing on a notepad. And what we know from research is that the first time an individual discloses in the workplace, if they don't get a positive response, they'll never speak of it again. And indeed, Christy was taken to a remote location and nearly lost her life and her baby's life a couple of months subsequent to that. So the men heard that there were so many points, potential points of intervention where someone could have stepped in, and you know, that they had a responsibility together with civil society and government and everyone else, but they, as leaders in our nation and as largest employers in our nation, had a responsibility to shift on this issue. So they developed a model for all organisations. It's a framework about domestic violence as a workplace issue. The mantra is no harm at work, no harm at home, that those two things are deeply connected. And we care about safety at work, so we're caring about safety at home. And every one of the Male Champions of Change organisations now is somewhere on that model. Some are more progressed. Rio Tinto, for example, the head of Rio Tinto travelled with me last week into New York to talk to the world about Rio's experience with training all their staff, so 19,000 in Australia, staff, about taking disclosures, how to recognise, how to send, how to offer support, all those types of things. It's a big commitment, but I think it's an area where Australia's now leading the world on domestic violence as a workplace issue, and organisations like Rio and our banks and Telstra and everything are taking the work they're doing in Australia and perpetuating it globally. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, and Westpac is a
Westpac's a great example here in New Zealand as well.
Yeah. So I want to round it out today and close by coming back to where we started this conversation, and you talked about data, and so I can't help but think of, as our champions of change are collecting data, and for those listed on the stock exchange, there is more reporting required now than before, not quite where Australia's at. But as we capture that data, even with targets, we haven't moved. I said this at the outset, we're doing a lot of stuff, but we just haven't moved the dial. It raises the question from time to time about should there be quotas, more so than targets. But as I listen to you today, and think about the reflections of Male Champions of Change, is it more about accountability? So the targets with accountability as opposed to quotas?
I think, look, I wouldn't take quotas totally off the table. The question is now the right time. I mean, in Australia, what we saw is a shift in the listing principles and recommendations. So every publicly listed company now must set a target for the number of women on their boards and elsewhere in the organisation. They must make that target transparent, and then they have to regularly report against that target in their annual report. Now, that was a shift, but it was a strong lever of change, and we went in quite a short period of time from 8% of women on our company boards to maybe 27% now. So that's continuing, and at this stage, because we made progress there, we haven't seen such a strong call for quotas. Of course, we've got quotas in our back pocket, because if we get to like 29% installed, then yes, we need to look at a quota. And you'll see the Scandinavian countries, many countries in Europe have gone that way as well. But I think for New Zealand, to at least have the organisations set their own target, it's the act of setting the target and signalling to the external world and internally that this is a priority. That's what's important. And then accountability against that target, so publicly reporting every year, combined with the other strategies that we've talked about, which is very much around building the inclusive culture. I think that will actually give New Zealand a bit more runway. You'll get further on, because what we're seeing is a bit of a dip, and what you don't want to happen is to go backwards. I mean, that would be terrible, particularly for a nation who's been such a leader for, and that's part of your history, that's part of your narrative. But you don't want the national narrative now to be, well, we were a leader, so we're still a leader, so we've done gender equality, because that's just not true. Yeah. That needs to shift, and I think a combination of these strategies would actually assist as well.
Terrific. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege to have you here in New Zealand and to share the experiences. I'm sure there's so much richness in those comments that we'll be able to pick up and apply. And hopefully we'll have you back at some point and we'll be further down the journey than we are today. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Vanessa. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.